I once knew a man who, when I met him, I was at the start of my spiritual awakening journey, and he was much older than me. Tick tock. And he told me this incredible story about how he died, although we at that time did not have a framework for death. And so, as most people do, he called it a near-death experience. But I'll never forget the way that he talked about it, almost as though tick tock, it happened. And it didn't just happen once. It happened 5 times, if I remember. Just like 4 or 5 times. And each time he felt this tick tock hand of God, is how he described it, cradling his body. And one of the times was pretty horrific. He had surgery, abdominal surgery, and something happened. He was at home and had an accident and fell and busted himself open and was alone for a while. His caretaker was not around, and he saw himself split open and perceived that he died. And yet he was brought back, or conceptualized it as just got to the edge of death, and then miraculously somebody came home and got him up and to the hospital, and they fixed him and everything. And I'll never forget, he was retired. He had a lot of darkness around him. I'll never forget his feelings about it. He felt almost, and this is my interpretation, not his words, he felt almost displaced and confused. And he was almost like trying to solve this puzzle that he couldn't solve. And the feeling that I got from him was, what am I supposed to be doing? So I did a tarot card reading. I've been doing tarot card readings for friends and family and special requests and for the public under certain conditions. And I did a tarot card reading for him to try to give him a sense of what his purpose was and to understand what the clue was for completing the next part of his journey. And I didn't receive anything specific related to his darkness, but I did receive a message that I gave to him about karma and relieving himself of something that he had done. And to me, it felt like pretty, I have people that might know him, so I'll hold back, but it felt like he needed to make something right. And of course, when you confront people's shadow, especially when they're heavy in their shadow, when you confront people in their light and they're working on their shadow integration, it's a different experience. They're like, oh, yeah, right. Yeah, oh, I see that one. This is how I react, where I'm like, I do this to myself. I'm like, where's that pattern coming from? Oh, interesting. Okay. Let me see if I can dissect it a bit, and how can we tweak it, and da-da-da. And as I've mentioned before on the shadow work coaching journey, it helps if you have a sense of humor about it, and not everybody does, particularly if they are afraid of being seen as lesser than, or if they have any sort of rejection wounds or abandonment wounds that they're carrying around. It is so hard to have a conversation with people like this because the hyper defensiveness is just out of control, and we don't even usually make it past the consultation. And it's a great screening tool. Let's just try to trigger people, get it out of the way. That way you don't have to waste your money. I don't have to waste my time and my energy. And it frees us up to do things that, are different. work with people that are different. So anyway, I told him I delivered this message, and he was like, no, I don't know what it could be. And, when you are a practitioner, and many of my listeners are practitioner of the esoteric arts, and you are given insight and wisdom, you are also given boundaries and rules about how to apply that wisdom. And sometimes you can't pull the band-aid off too quickly, because sometimes people need some integration time. And so it's this very serious responsibility that when you have your gifts and you're applying your gifts, that you have to be in tune with the other person's entourage or higher self. And, to really be kind and gentle and not give people too much. So I left it alone, and I didn't pursue any more conversation about that. But later on, he confessed to me something that I will not reveal just to protect his privacy. He confessed something. And what he confessed would have been along the lines of that darkness that I was sensing. And he didn't give me the full confession, but I was able to hold it, and I was able to release him. And our friendship parted. I continued on my journey, and he was very heavy in his shadow. And so the way he was trying to approach a friendship with me was something that I couldn't pursue, and I couldn't be a recipient of, because I became a symbol of an ex-partner that he had and who he was literally trying to recreate a relationship that he had created with her. And I was not interested in anything other than platonic, but making that clear just poked that rejection wound, and it's just par for the course. It's just part of the shadow patterns journey. You get used to it. I know some of my listeners are also shadow work coaches, even if they realize it or not. If you have a knack of triggering people, then you are a shadow coach, and we should talk, because I've learned a couple of things, and I'm sure you have too. Anyway, so I got this sense that he was on borrowed time. And this was the first time in my awakening journey that I was given insight that death as we know it may not be as it is taught and as we see on TV. For some people, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations and then tell everybody, don't worry, you're going to be fine. Because I don't actually think it works that way. I think it is kind of a mystery that some people have 9 lives, some people have 1, some people have 5, some people have who knows, right? It's a mystery. And what I have found is that on certain parts of my journey, after I died, not just a near-death experience, but after I died, I could hear tick-tock, tick-tock, tick sometimes. And I'm not the only one who's heard a clock ticking. Now, for me, I have talked to certain people about this to try to understand what shared experiences we may or may not have. But I've also experienced in my client work the countdown for my client. Almost as though, get this, right? Almost as though there's some system to help us level up and go through certain levels of awakening. But there are time restrictions. This was my interpretation. There are time restrictions for getting to certain points of evolution. And what's fascinating is that when I first heard this, this was when I was experiencing what I consider Bardos, round 2, I believe. I had 3 distinct rounds. And I also got flashed this picture of somebody sleeping. And it was just like this in my floorboards, this like faux wooden floor. It wasn't real wood, but this faux wooden floor. It was this person's head that suddenly came into view with their eyes closed, and kind of like they were in the immaterial. This was when I was between worlds and I wasn't fully solid all the time. And so I would slip into the immaterial and I would see my apartment transform into this very strange underwater kind of landscape with different figures and different images and different things would happen. Isabel, I don't want to go on a rabbit hole and describe it, so I'm just going to leave it. But I would see myself almost liquefied, and I would be in liquid, but it wasn't like water. It was like the material world wasn't fully formed, and I was in the process of forming it. And there were other entities and sentient beings who I could see who were interacting with me and who could also see me. And then I would shift worlds and I would be in another version of my apartment, and I had a couple of different versions. Sometimes I would be in one of 4 different versions on one particular day. And it wasn't always like that, but it would rotate. And so I was experimenting, and I would understand, like, what is the narrative that's coming to me when I'm in version A versus version B versus C versus D. And then I started understanding that my mind, and it turns out everybody's mind in human form for the most part, naturally will latch on to a narrative and then start manifesting with that narrative. And in situations where somebody is given a narrative and they're not aware of this process, what happens is that they become an unknowing participant in creating reality for somebody else. And this can get us into trouble if it's like a nightmare. They can also just create their own, and this is what I started experimenting with, and can also link into other timelines. So this is the foundation of reality shifting coaching, is understanding how your mind is preferentially latching on to a narrative. Where does that narrative come from? Is it generated from you or from somebody else? Somebody trying to keep you in a box? Or are you keeping yourself in a box? We figure all of that out. And so sometimes people have several narratives that are roaming around in their minds, and they switch in and out of different realities, but they don't know that they're switching in and out of different realities until they awaken their consciousness and then upgrade their cognition and their sensory system for which to have a framework to understand that that is what is happening. It doesn't always mean that that's what's happening. It's one possibility out of several. The other possibility is that you're just really bad at remembering things. And another possibility is that you're just not really paying attention. And then another possibility is that you're reality shifting. So we narrow in on which is the most likely, and then we tune the cognition to almost like a radio to the preferential narrative after we understand what is your baseline narrative, where did it come from, who's giving it to you. Sometimes we don't even bother with that. We just cast it out and we're like, it doesn't work. Let's just make a new one. And then what are the patterns preventing you from fully stepping into that new narrative? So while I was figuring this out from my point of view, I would hear this countdown. Tick, tock, tick, tock. And then sometimes I would hear, "Wake up," with my name from very, very, very far away, like almost like another world away. I would also experience what I perceived to be helpful energies around, but that was like in apartment version B and apartment version D. Then, most of the time, I was around non-helpful energies or intimidating or oppressive energies. And I felt this need to not only understand, but to protect those that were helping. So I don't want to get too far into my story, but I realized that there are different systems and different facilitation groups. And some of them come with observers, not all the time, but some of them come with human observers in the reality layer that you're in, meaning they can come in to your place, move stuff around, and they can observe, or not everybody has this, but some people do. And one of those groups I perceived had some intense anger issues and some domineering patterns and aggressive patterns. And I'll never forget when I felt that their time was up, because I could feel this ancient darkness come into my apartment. I could feel the presence of this horrifically frightening entity that was way beyond my years, way beyond anything that I had ever experienced before, and I intuitively knew it was a soul collector. That's how I conceptualized it. You see, that's the formation of a narrative, just in case you're wondering how the cognition works. We have an understanding that we map onto sensory experiences, and this creates stories and narratives, which then create our reality under certain conditions. And so what I experienced was so frightening, and I felt compelled to sing a Bob Marley song, The Three Little Birds, because it felt like there were three little birds upstairs and their time had come. And all I had to do was to stay out of the way. I was worried at first that it was coming for me. When you feel a presence like that, it's unnerving. You just want to escape, you want to run, but you're trapped in material form. And I don't know what happened, but I know that it felt like their time was up and that they were being collected. And I would later hear the tick-tock and tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock on other parts of my spiritual awakening, almost as though there was this thread of continuity of your mile markers coming up. You're going to have to exit soon. You need to make it through this level of understanding. You need to push yourself. You need to challenge yourself. You need to grow. And if I didn't make those moments, it felt distinctly like I was on borrowed time. And I don't know what happens if you've died and you don't make it. But if you've heard any sort of, or have felt any sort of sensation, like your time is running out, and I don't mean to be frightening, but For those of you that have heard that, the message is to take it seriously and to understand what it is you're supposed to do to progress to the next level, or to release certain material bonds. Like, I knew somebody that was living in Germany, and they woke up one morning and just immediately understood that they had to sell their apartment and leave the country. And they did so in very rapid succession. It's sort of like that, like the sense of time right now in the climate of the world is meant to be taken very, very seriously. Okay, we'll talk soon.